Hey guys, we're gonna see how much of this book I can read. I should get some like silly little music going. The library. Good shit. Except it won't fuck. That's loud. I don't know how audible that is, but hopefully just enough. I have to read book for class. So we're doing our best to read book for class. So we're reading The Awakening by Chopin. I don't know how racist it's going to get, but it probably will. Just FYI. And I ain't reading those words. A green and yellow parrot, which hung in a cage outside the door, kept repeating over and over, allez-vous en, sapristi. That's all right. He could speak a little Spanish, and also a language which nobody understood, unless it was the mockingbird that hung on the other side of the door, whistling his fluty notes out upon the breeze with maddening persistence. Mr. Pontellier, unable to read his newspaper with any degree of comfort, arose with an expression and an exclamation of disgust. He walked down the gallery and across the narrow bridges which connected the Lebrun cottages one with another. He had been seated before the door of the main house. The parrot and the mockingbird were the property of Madame Lebrun, and they had the right to make all the noise they wished. Mr. Pontellier had the privilege of quitting their society when they ceased to be entertaining. He stopped before the door of his own cottage, which was the fourth one from the main building and next to the last. Seating himself in a wicker rocker which was there, he once more applied himself to the task of reading the newspaper. The day was Sunday. The paper was old. The Sunday papers had not yet reached Grand Isle. He was already acquainted with the market reports, and he glanced restlessly over the editorials and bits of news which he had not had time to read before quitting New Orleans the day before. I want to know which mic this is using real quick. Properties. She's the one. Lol. How's that gang? Sorry. Anyways. Mr. Pontellier wore eyeglasses. He was a man of 40, of medium height and rather slender build. He stooped a little. His hair was brown and straight, parted on one side. His beard was neatly and closely trimmed. Once in a while he withdrew his glance from the newspaper and looked about him. There was more noise than ever over at the house. The main building was called the house, to distinguish it from the cottages. The chattering and whistling birds were still at it. Two young girls, the Farival twins, were playing a duet from Zampa upon the piano. Madame Lebrun was bustling in and out, giving orders to a high key and a yard boy whenever she got inside the house, and directions in an equally high voice to a dining-room servant whenever she got outside. She was a fresh, pretty woman, clad always in white with elbow sleeves. Her starched skirts crinkled as she came and went. Further down, before one of the cottages, a lady in black was walking demurely up and down, telling her beads. A good many persons of the pension had gone over to the Chenier Caminada in Baudelaire's lugger to hear mass. Okay, those are words. Some young people were out under the water oaks playing croquet. Mr. Pontellier's two children were the sturdy little fellows of 4 and 5. A quadroon nurse followed them about with a faraway, meditative air. I was thinking Faraday. Mr. Pontellier finally lit a cigar and began to smoke, letting the paper drag idly from his hand. He fixed his gaze upon a white sunshade that was advancing at a snail's pace from the beach. He could see it plainly between the gaunt trunks of the water oaks and across the stretch of yellow chamomile. The gulf looked far away, melting hazily into the blue of the horizon. The sunshade continued to approach slowly. Beneath its pink-lined shelter were his wife, Mrs. Pontellier, and young Robert Lebrun. When they reached the cottage, the two seated themselves with some appearance of fatigue upon the upper step of the porch, facing each other, each leaning against a supporting post.
"What folly, to bathe at such an hour in such heat!" exclaimed Mr. Pontellier. He had himself taken a plunge at daylight. That was why the morning seemed long to him. "You are burnt beyond recognition," he added, looking at his wife, as one looks at a valuable piece of personal property which has suffered some damage. She held up her hands, strong, shapely hands, and surveyed them critically, drawing up her fawn sleeves above the wrists. Looking at them reminded her of her rings, which she had given to her husband before leaving for the beach. She silently reached out to him, and he, understanding, took the rings from his vest pocket and dropped them into her open palm. She slipped them upon her fingers, then, clasping her knees, she looked across at Robert and began to laugh. The rings sparkled upon her fingers. He sent back an answering smile. "What is it?" asked Pontellier, looking lazily and amused from one to another. It was some utter nonsense, some adventure out there in the water, and they both tried to relate it at once. It did not seem half so amusing when told. They realized this, and so did Mr. Pontellier. He yawned and stretched himself. Then he got up, saying he had half a mind to go over to Klein's hotel and play a game of billiards. "Come go along, Lebrun," he proposed to Robert, but Robert admitted quite frankly that he preferred to stay where he was and talk to Mrs. Pontellier. "Well, send him about his business when he bores you, Edna," instructed her husband as he prepared to leave. "Here, take the umbrella," she exclaimed, holding it out to him. He accepted the sunshade, and, lifting it over his head, descended the steps and walked away. "Coming back to dinner?" his wife called after him. He halted a moment and shrugged his shoulders. He felt in his vest pocket. There was a $10 bill there. He did not know. Perhaps he would return for the early dinner, and perhaps he would not. It all depended on the company which he found over at Klein's and the size of the game. He did not say this, but she understood it, and laughed, nodding goodbye to him. Both children wanted to follow their father when they saw him starting out. He kissed them and promised to bring them back bonbons and peanuts. That's chapter 1. I need water. Just go water. More. Oh, okay. Anyways. Okay. Chapter 2. Mrs. Pontellier's eyes were quick and bright. They were yellowish-brown, about the color of her hair. She had a way of turning them swiftly upon an object and holding them there as if lost in some inward maze of contemplation or thought. Her eyebrows were a shade darker than her hair. They were thick and almost horizontal, emphasizing the depth of her eyes. She was rather handsome than beautiful. Her face was captivating by reason of a certain frankness of expression and contradictory subtle play of features. Her manner was engaging. Oh, wait, shit. One sec. Copy link. Hell yeah. That was a pretty good burp if I say so myself. Anyways. Alright. Robert rolled a cigarette. He smoked cigarettes because he could not afford cigars, he said. He had a cigar in his pocket, which Mr. Pontellier had presented him with, and he was saving it for his after-dinner smoke. This seemed quite proper and natural on his part. In coloring he was not unlike his companion. A clean-shaved face made the resemblance more pronounced than it would otherwise have been. There rested no shadow of care upon his open countenance. His eyes gathered in and reflected the light and languor of the summer day. Mrs. Pontellier reached over for a palm leaf fan that lay on the porch and began to fan herself, while Robert sent between his lips light puffs from his cigarette. They chatted incessantly about the things around them, their amusing adventure out in the water. It had again assumed its entertaining aspect, about the wind, the trees, the people who had gone to the Cheniere, I don't know French, about the children playing croquet under the oaks, and the Farival twins, who were now performing the overture to The Poet and the Peasant. Robert talked a good deal about himself. He was very young and did not know any better. Mrs. Pontellier talked a little about herself for the same reason. Each was interested in what the other said. Robert spoke of his intention to go to Mexico in the autumn, where fortune awaited him. He was always intending to go to Mexico, but some way never got there. Meanwhile, he held on to his modest position in a mercantile house in New Orleans, where an equal familiarity with English, French, and Spanish gave him no small value as a clerk and correspondent. He was spending his summer vacation, as he always did, with his mother at Grand Isle. In former times, before Robert could remember, the house had been a summer luxury of the Lebruns. Now, flanked by its dozen or more cottages, which were always filled with exclusive visitors from Courtier Français. Courtier Français. I hate French, bro. It enabled Madame Lebrun to maintain the easy and comfortable existence which appeared to be her birthright. Mrs. Pontellier talked about her father's Mississippi plantation and her girlhood home in the old Kentucky bluegrass country. She was an American woman with a small infusion of French, which seemed to have been lost in dilution. She read a letter from her sister, who was away in the East, and who had engaged herself to be married. Robert was interested, and wanted to know what manner of girls the sisters were, what the father was like, and how long the mother had been dead. When Mrs. Pontellier folded the letter, it was time for her to dress for the early dinner. "I see Léonce isn't coming back," she said, with a glance in the direction whence her husband had disappeared. Robert supposed he was not, as there were a good many New Orleans club men over at Klein's. When Mrs. Pontellier left him to enter her room, the young man descended the steps and strolled over towards the croquet players, where, during the half hour before dinner, he amused himself with the little Pontellier children who were very fond of him. Okay, interesting. Apparently I only had to read chapter 1, but that was really short, and I'm not going to want to read this later in the week, so I'm going to get as far into it as I can. Real quickly, though, I got to change out my ice pack, because I fucked up my knee the other day, which sucks, and I'm mad about it. But I'm icing it, because I'm a good little athlete, and I know myself. I'm just praying that I didn't, tear a meniscus or something, because that would suck. Dude, I don't have any athletic tape, and I'm so mad about it, because I really don't want to go to CVS to buy some. And I lost my stupid computer mouse. And I'm just like, come on, man. Come on. Just can the mouse, come back and find me? I always treated you well, mouse. What the heck? Alright, get my blanket. My blankie. Get comfy cozy. Got my... Come on. Alright, ice pack in place. Alright. Chapter 3. It was 11 o'clock that night when Mr. Pontellier returned from Klein's hotel. Goddamn. He was in an excellent humor, in high spirits and very talkative. His entrance awoke his wife, who was in bed, and fast asleep when he came in. He talked to her while he undressed, telling her anecdotes and bits of news and gossip that he had gathered during the day. Sorry, I'm arranging my blanket. I want to get comfy cozy. From his trousers pocket, he took a fistful of crumpled banknotes and a good deal of silver coin, which he piled on the bureau indiscriminately with keys, knife, handkerchief, and whatever else happened to be in his pockets. I low-key... Hold up real quick. I have a funny idea. Well, that spoiled it. Oh, well, it's showing anyways. Bro. Where's my freaking window capture? And answered him with little half utterances. He thought it very discouraging that his wife, who was the sole object of his existence, evinced so little interest in things which concerned him and valued so little in his conversation. Damn. Mr. Pontellier had forgotten the bonbons and peanuts for the boys. Notwithstanding, he loved them very much, and went into the adjoining rooms where they slept to take a look at them and make sure that they were resting comfortably. The result of his investigation was far from satisfactory. He turned and shifted the youngsters about in bed. One of them began to kick and talk about a basket full of crabs. Mr. Pontellier returned to his wife with the information that Raoul had a high fever and needed looking after. Ruh-roh. Mrs. Pontellier was quite sure that Raoul had no fever. He had gone to bed perfectly well, she said, and nothing had ailed him all day. Mr. Pontellier was too well acquainted with fever symptoms to be mistaken. He assured her that the child was consuming at the moment in the next room. He reproached his wife for her inattention, her habitual neglect of the children. If it was not a mother's place to look after children, whose on earth was it? He himself had his hands full with his brokerage business. He could not be in two places at once, making a living for his family on the street, and staying at home to see that no harm befell them. He talked in a monotonous, insistent way. Mrs. Pontellier sprang out of bed and went into the next room. She soon came back and sat on the edge of the bed, leaning her head down on the pillow. She said nothing and refused to answer her husband when he questioned her. When his cigar was smoked out, he went to bed, and in half a minute he was fast asleep. Mrs. Pontellier, by that time, was thoroughly awake. She began to cry a little, and wiped her hands at the sleeve of her peignoir. Blowing out the candle which her husband had left burning, she slipped her bare feet into a pair of satin mules at the foot of the bed and went out on the porch, where she sat down in the wicker chair and began to rock gently to and fro. It was then past midnight. The cottages were all dark. A single faint light gleamed out from the hallway of the house. There was no sound abroad except the hooting of an old owl in the top of a water oak, and the everlasting voice of the sea. That was not and the everlasting voice of the sea that was not uplifted at that soft hour. It broke like a mournful lullaby upon the night. The tears came so fast to Mrs. Pontellier's eyes that the damp sleeve of her peignoir no longer served to dry them. She was holding back the back of the chair with one hand. Her loose sleeve had slipped almost to the shoulder of her uplifted arm. Turning, she thrust her face, steaming and wet, into the bend of her arm, and she went on crying there, not caring any longer to dry her face, her eyes, her arms. She could not have told why she was crying. Such experiences as the foregoing were not uncommon in her married life. They seemed never before to have weighed much against the abundance of her husband's kindness, and a uniform devotion which had come to be tacit? We're Googling that word, guys. New word. Something understood, implied, or implied without being stated. Cool. Oh, like tact. Like having tact. It's like under the weather. Not under the weather, under the radar. Okay, where were we? Uniform devotion, which has come to be I didn't Google the pronunciation, though. Tacit. Which had become tacit and self-understood. An indescribable oppression which seemed to generate in some unfamiliar part of her consciousness filled her whole being with a vague anguish. It was like a shadow. I promise my Wi-Fi's on. Oh, there we are. I'm glad I have this up in another window. Anyways. The following morning, Mr. Pontellier was up in good time to take the Rockaway, which was to convey him to the steamer at the wharf. He was returning to the city to his business, and they would not see him again at the island till the coming Saturday. He had regained his composure, which seemed to have been somewhat impaired the night before. He was eager to be gone, as he looked forward to a lively week in Carondelet Street. Carondelet, ugly dog. No, it's not. It's got a very pretty No, it doesn't have the statue anymore. It's got a very pretty little pedestal. Mr. Pontellier gave his wife half of the money which he had brought away from Klein's hotel the evening before. She liked money as well as most women, and accepted it with no little satisfaction. "It will buy a handsome wedding present for Sister Janet," she exclaimed, smoothing out the bills as she counted them one by one. "Oh, we'll treat Sister Janet better than that, my dear," he laughed as he prepared to kiss her goodbye. The boys were tumbling about, clinging to his legs, imploring that numerous things be brought back to them. Mr. Pontellier was a great favorite, and ladies, men, children, even nurses were always on hand to say goodbye to him. Why does that not? I swear there was a goodbye earlier that had an E. What's the difference? Am I crazy? I thought I just saw it. I might be crazy. Is there a difference? Oh. Well, that one has a dash. Two etymology for this. Oh, wait, that one does have a... Oh, whoops. Damn. Now I want to Google the difference between goodbye and goodbye. Whatever. The boys were tumbling about, clinging to his legs, imploring that numerous things be brought back to them. Mr. Pontellier was a great favorite, and ladies, men, children, even nurses... Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Great. In 10 minutes, the AC is going to be shut down for an hour. Yay. They gave us a great 10-minute heads up. Okay, where was I? Ladies, men, children, even nurses were always on hand to say goodbye to him. His wife stood, smiling and waving, the boys shouting as he disappeared in the old Rockaway down the sandy road. A few days later, a box arrived from Mrs. Pontellier from New Orleans. It was from her husband. Oh, he's just gone. Okay. It was filled with friandises, with luscious and toothsome bits, the finest of fruits, pâtés, a rare bottle or two, delicious syrups, and bonbons in abundance. Hell yeah. Mrs. Pontellier was always very generous with the contents of such a box. She was quite used to receiving them when away from home. The pâtés and fruit were brought to the dining room, the bonbons were passed around, and the ladies, selecting with dainty and discriminating fingers and a little greedily, all declared that Mr. Pontellier was the best husband in the world. Mrs. Pontellier was forced to admit that she knew of none better. It would have been a difficult matter for Mr. Pontellier to define to his own satisfaction or anyone else's wherein his wife failed. Jesus. What a long paragraph. Crap. Did it? Freaking. It did. That's annoying. Anyways. Okay. It would have been a difficult matter for Mr. Pontellier to define his own satisfaction or anyone else's wherein his wife failed in her duty towards their children. Sure. It was something which he felt rather than perceived, and he never voiced the feeling without subsequent regret and ample atonement. Good. If one of the little Pontellier boys took a tumble whilst at play, he was not apt to rush crying to his mother's arms for comfort. He would more likely pick himself up, wipe the water out of his eyes and the sand out of his mouth, and go on playing. Good. Crying ones are annoying. Tots as they were, they pulled together and stood their ground in childish battles with doubled fists and uplifted voices, which usually prevailed against the other mother tots. The quadroon nurse was looked upon as a huge encumbrance, only good to button up waists and panties and to brush and part hair, since it seemed to be a law of society that hair must be parted and brushed. In short, Mrs. Pontellier was not a mother woman. The mother woman seemed to prevail that summer at Grand Isle. It was easy to know them, fluttering about with extended protecting wings when any harm, real or imaginary, threatened their precious brood. They were women who idolized their children, worshipped their husbands, and esteemed it a holy privilege to efface themselves as individuals and grow wings as ministering angels. Okay. Many of them were delicious in the role. What? One of them was the embodiment of every womanly grace and charm. If her husband did not adore her, he was a brute, deserving of death by slow torture. Damn right. Her name was Adele Ratignole. Ratignole. Girl, I don't know your name. We call her Ratignole. There are no words. Stop posting things. There are no words to describe her save the old ones that have served so often to picture the bygone heroine of romance and the fair lady of our dreams. There was nothing subtle or hidden about her charms. Her beauty was all there, flaming and apparent, the spun gold hair that comb nor confining pin could restrain, the blue eyes that were like nothing but sapphires, two lips that pouted, that were so red one could only think of cherries or some other delicious crimson fruit in looking at them. Sorry. She was growing a little stout, but it did not seem to detract an iota from the grace of every step, pose, gesture. One would not have wanted her white neck a mite less full or her beautiful arms more slender. Never were hands more exquisite than hers. And it was a joy to look at them when she threaded her needle or adjusted her gold thimble to her taper middle finger as she sewed away on the little night drawers or fashioned a bodice or bib. Madame Ratignole was very fond of Mrs. Pontellier, and often she took her sewing and went over to sit with her in the afternoons. She was sitting there the afternoon of the day the box arrived from New Orleans. She had possession of the rocker, and she was busily engaged in sewing upon a diminutive pair of night drawers. She had brought the pattern of the drawers for Mrs. Pontellier to cut out, a marvel of construction, fashioned to enclose a baby's body so effectually that only two small eyes might look out from the garment, like that word, like a person who lives in the Arctics. They were designed for winter wear, when treacherous drafts came down chimneys and insidious currents of deadly cold found their way through keyholes. Mrs. Pontellier's mind was quite at rest concerning the present material needs of her children, and she would not see the use of anticipating and making winter night garments the subject of her summer meditations. But she did not want to appear unamiable and uninterested, so she had brought forth newspapers, which she spread upon the floor of the gallery, and under Madame Ratignole's directions she had cut out a pattern of the impervious garment. Robert was there, seated as he had been the Sunday before, and Mrs. Pontellier also occupied her former position on the upper step, leaning listlessly against the post. Beside her was a box of bonbons, which she held out at intervals to Madame Ratignole. Yummy. The lady seemed at a loss to make a selection, but finally settled upon a stick of nougat, wondering if it were not too rich, whether it could possibly hurt her. Madame Ratignole had been married 7 years. About every 2 years she had a baby. At the time, she had 3 babies and was beginning to think of a 4th one. She was always talking about her condition. Her condition was in no way apparent, and no one would have known a thing about it but for her persistence in making it the subject of conversation. Robert started to reassure her, asserting that he had known a lady who had subsisted upon nougat during the entire, but seeing the color mount into Mrs. Pontellier's face, he checked himself and changed the subject. Mrs. Pontellier, though she had married a Creole, was not thoroughly at home in the society of Creoles. Never before had she been thrown so intimately among them. There were only Creoles that summer at the Bruns. They all knew each other and felt like one large family, among whom existed the most amicable relations. A characteristic which distinguished them and most impressed Mrs. Pontellier most forcibly was their entire absence of prudery. Their freedom of expression was at first incomprehensible to her, though she had no difficulty in reconciling it with a lofty chastity, which in the Creole woman seems to be inborn and unmistakable. Never would Edna Pontellier forget the shock with which she heard Madame Rattagnole relating to old Monsieur Farival, the harrowing story of one of her accouchements, withholding no intimate detail. She was growing accustomed to like shocks, but she could not keep the mounting color back from her cheeks. Oftener than once, her coming had interrupted the droll story with which Robert was entertaining some amused group of married women. A book had gone the rounds of the pension. When it came her turn to read it, she did so with profound astonishment. She felt moved to read the book in secret and solitude, though none of the others had done so, to hide it from view at the sound of approaching footsteps. It was openly criticized and freely discussed at table. Mrs. Pontellier gave over being astonished and concluded that wonders would never cease. White woman astonished at reading porn book for the first time. Hell yeah, girl. Get into that New Orleans vibe. Read that shit outside, baby. Show it around. They formed a congenial group sitting there that summer afternoon, Madame Rattagnole sewing away, often stopping to relate a story or incident with much expressive gesture of her perfect hands. Robert and Mrs. Pontellier sitting idle, exchanging occasional words, glances, or smiles, which indicated a certain advanced stage of intimacy and camaraderie. Ooh! That was probably loud, I'm sorry. He had lived in her shadow during the past month. No one thought anything of it. Many had predicted that Robert would devote himself to Mrs. Pontellier when he arrived. Since the age of 15, which was 11 years before, he's 26, cool. Robert each summer at the Grand Isle had constituted himself the devoted attendant of some fair dame or damsel. Sometimes it was a young girl, again a widow, but often as not, it was some interesting married woman. He's a ladies' man. For 2 consecutive seasons, he lived in the sunlight of Mademoiselle Duvigny's presence, but she died between summers. Damn! Then Robert posed as an inconsolable, prostrating himself at the feet of Madame Rattagnole for whatever crumbs of sympathy and comfort she might have pleased to vouchsafe. Mrs. Pontellier liked to sit and gaze at her fair companion as she might look upon a faultless Madonna. Could anyone fathom the cruelty beneath that fair exterior? Murmured Robert. She knew that I adored her once, and she let me adore her. It was, Robert, come, go, stand up, sit down, do this, do that, see if the baby sleeps, my thimble, please, that I left God knows where, come and read Daudette to me while I sew. For example, I never had to ask. You were always there under my feet, like a troublesome cat. You mean like an adoring dog. Just as soon as Rattagnole appeared on the scene, then it was like a dog. Passez, adieu, allez-vous in. Perhaps I feared to make Alphonse jealous, she interjoined, with excessive naivete. That made them all laugh, the right hand jealous of the left, the heart jealous of the soul. But for that matter, the Creole husband is never jealous. With him, the gangrene passion is one which has become dwarfed by disuse. God damn, what a line. Meanwhile, Robert, addressing Mrs. Pontellier, continued to tell one of addressing Mrs. Pontellier, continued to tell of his one-time hopeless passion for Madame Rattagnole, of sleepless nights, of consuming flames till the very sea sizzled when he took his daily plunge, while the lady at the needle kept up a little running, contemptuous comment, blague fessier gurbeteva. Something, it says farce, so I'm going to assume liar. She's probably calling him a liar. He never assumed this serio-comic tone alone when alone with Mrs. Pontellier. She never knew precisely what to make of it. At that moment, it was impossible for her to guess how much of it was just and what proportion was earnest. It was understood that he had often spoken words of love to Madame Rattiganoli without any thought of being taken seriously. Mrs. Pontellier was glad that he had not assumed a similar role towards herself. It would have been unacceptable and annoying. Mrs. Pontellier had brought her sketching materials, which she sometimes dabbled with in an unprofessional way. She liked the dabbling. She felt in it satisfaction of a kind which no other employment afforded her. She had long wished to try herself on Madame Rattiganoli. Never had that lady seemed a more tempting subject than at that moment, seated there like some sensuous Madonna, with the gleam of the fading day enriching her splendid color. They should fuck. I think they should fuck. Anyways. Who else up shipping Rattiganoli and Pontellier? Robert crossed over and seated himself upon shit, the step below Mrs. Pontellier, that he might watch her work. She handled her brushes with a certain ease and freedom which came not from long and close acquaintance with them, but from a natural aptitude. Robert followed her work with close attention, giving forth little ejaculatory expressions of appreciation in French, which he addressed to Madame Rattiganoli. C'est pas mal. Et si connaît de la chose, oui. If I say it like I'm drunk enough, if I slur my words and act like I'm drunk enough, it sounds like French. Mais c'est pas mal. Et si connaît de la chose. I don't know French. Oui. Anyways, during his oblivious attention, he once quietly rested his head against Mrs. Pontellier's arm. Aww, as gently she repulsed him. Damn. Once again, he repeated the offense. She could not but believe it had to be thoughtlessness on his part. Nah, dog, it's on purpose. Yet that was no reason she should submit to it, Queen. She did not remonstrate, except again to repulse him, quietly but firmly. He offered no apology. The picture completed bore no resemblance to Madame Rattiganoli. She was greatly disappointed to find that it did not look like her. But it was a fair enough piece of work, and in many respects satisfying. Mrs. Pontellier evidently did not think so. After surveying the sketch critically, she drew a broad smudge of paint across its surface, and crumpled the paper between her hands. No. The youngsters came tumbling up the steps, and the quadroon following at the respectable distance which they required her to observe. Damn. Mrs. Pontellier made them carry her paints and things into the house. She sought to detain them for a little talk and some pleasantry, but they were greatly in earnest. They had only come to investigate the contents of the bonbon box. They accepted without murmuring what she chose to give them, each holding out two chubby hands scoop-like, in the vain hope that they might be filled, and then away they went. The sun was low in the west, and the breeze soft and languorous that came up from the south, charged with the seductive odor of the sea. I wouldn't call it seductive, but all right, babe. Children freshly befurbelowed. Jesus Christ. Were gathering for their games under the oaks. Their voices were high and penetrating. Madame Rattiganoli folded her sewing, placing thimble, scissors, and thread all neatly together in the roll, which she pinned securely. She complained of faintness. Mrs. Pontellier flew for the cologne water and a fan. She bathed Madame Rattiganoli's face with cologne, while Robert plied the fan with unnecessary vigor. The spell was soon over, and Mrs. Pontellier could not help wondering if there were not little imagination responsible for its origin, for the rose tint had never faded from her friend's face. She stood watching the fair woman walk down the long line of galleries with the grace and majesty which queens— Ow, fuck, balls, ass, shit. I just fucking slammed my fucking pinky. With the grace and majesty which queens are sometimes supposed to possess. Her little ones ran to meet her. 2 of them clung about her white skirts. The third she took from its nurse, and with 1,000 endearments bore it along her own fond encircling arms. Though, as everyone well knew, the doctor had forbidden her to lift so much as a pin. Girl, what's her problem? I want to know. I want to know what's wrong with her. Her condition. I'm going to go with low blood sugar. high blood pressure, low blood pressure. I don't fucking know. Are you going bathing? Asked Robert of Mrs. Pontellier. It was not so much a question as a reminder. Oh, no, she answered with a tone of indecision. I'm tired, I think not. Her glance wandered from his face away toward the gulf, whose sonorous murmur reached her like a loving but imperative entreaty. Oh, come, he insisted. You mustn't miss your bath. Come on. The water must be delicious. It will not hurt you. Come. He reached for her big, rough straw hat that hung on a peg outside the door and put it on her head. They descended the steps and walked away together toward the beach. The sun was low in the west, and the breeze was soft and warm. Edna Pontellier could not have told why, wishing to go to the beach with Robert, she should in the first place have declined, and in the second place have followed in obedience to one of the two contradictory impulses which impelled her. A certain light was beginning to dawn dimly within her, the light which, showing the way, forbids it. At that early period it served but to bewilder her. It moved her to dreams, to thoughtfulness, to the shadowy anguish which had overcome her the midnight when she had abandoned herself to tears. In short, Mrs. Pontellier was beginning to realize her position in the universe as a human being, and to recognize her relations as an individual to the world within and about her. This may seem like a ponderous weight of wisdom to descend upon the soul of a young woman of 28, perhaps more wisdom than the Holy Ghost is usually pleased to vouchsafe to any woman. But the beginning of things, of a world especially, is necessarily vague, tangled, chaotic, and exceedingly disturbing. How few of us ever emerge from such beginning? Shit. How many souls perish in its tumult? The voice of the sea is seductive, never ceasing, whispering, clamoring, murmuring, inviting the soul to wander for a spell in the abysses of solitude, to lose itself in the mazes of inward contemplation. The voice of the sea speaks to the soul. The touch of the sea is sensuous, enfolding the body in its soft, close embrace. Alright, banger. Got some good shit. Mrs. Pontellier was not a woman given to confidences, a characteristic hitherto contrary to her nature. Even as a child, she had lived her own small life all within herself. At a very early period, she had apprehended instinctively the dual life, that outward existence which conforms, the inward life which questions. That summer at Grand Isle, she began to loosen a little the mantle of reserve that had always enveloped her. There must have been influences, both subtle and apparent, working in their several ways to induce her to do this. But the most obvious was the influence of Adele Ratigonole. The excessive physical charm of the Creole had first attracted her, for Edna had a sensuous susceptibility to beauty. You're into her, dog. Kiss. Then the candor of the woman's whole existence, which everyone might read, and which formed so striking a contrast to her own habitual reserve. This might have furnished a link. Who can tell what metals the gods use in forging the subtle bond which we call sympathy, which we might as well call love? Kiss! The two women went away one morning to the beach together, arm in arm under the huge white sunshade. Edna had prevailed upon Madame Ratiganole to leave the children behind, though she could not induce her to relinquish the diminutive roll of needlework, which Adele begged to be allowed to slip into the depths of her pocket. In some unaccountable way, they had escaped from Robert. God knows how. The walk to the beach was no inconsiderable one, consisting as it did of a long sandy path upon which a sporadic and tangled growth... Okay, that's not bad. Sorry, I got a grade. Stop doing things. I don't want to know. Anyways. Upon which a sporadic and tangled growth that bordered it on either side made frequent and unexpected inroads. There were acres of yellow chamomile reaching out on either hand. Further away still, vegetable gardens abounded, with frequent small plantations of orange or lemon trees intervening. The dark green clusters glistened from afar in the sun. The women were both of goodly height, Madame Ratiganole possessing the more feminine and matronly figure. The charm of Edna Pontellier's physique stole insensibly upon you. The lines of her body were long, clean, and symmetrical. It was a body which occasionally fell into splendid poses. There was no suggestion of the trim, stereotyped fashion played about it. A casual and indiscriminating observer in passing might not cast a second glance upon the figure, but with more feeling and discernment he would have realized the noble beauty of its modeling, and the graceful severity of poise and movement which made Edna Pontellier different from the crowd. She wore a cool muslin that morning, white with a waving vertical line of brown running through it, also a white linen collar and the big straw hat which she had taken from the peg outside the door. The hat rested any way on her yellow-brown hair, that waved a little, was heavy, and clung close to her head. Madame Ratiganole, more careful of her complexion, had twined a gauze veil about her head. She wore dogskin gloves, with gauntlets that protected her wrists. She was dressed in pure white, with a fluffiness of ruffles that became her. The draperies and fluttering things which she wore suited her rich, luxuriant beauty, as a greater severity of line could not have done. There were a number of bathhouses along the beach, of rough but solid construction, built with small protecting galleries facing the water. Each house consisted of 2 compartments, and each family at Le Brun's possessed a compartment for itself, fitted out with all the essential paraphernalia of the bath and whatever other conveniences the owners might desire. The 2 women had no intention of bathing. They had just strolled down to the beach for a walk and to be alone near the water. The Pontellier and Ratiganole compartments adjoined one another under the same roof. Mrs. Pontellier had brought down her key through force of habit. Unlocking the door of her bathroom, she went inside and soon emerged, bringing a rug, which she spread upon the floor of the gallery, and 2 huge hair pillows covered with crash, which she placed against the front of the building. The 2 seated themselves there in the shade of the porch, side by side, with their backs against the pillows and their feet extended. Madame Ratiganole removed her veil, wiped her face with a rather delicate handkerchief, and fanned herself with the fan which she always carried, suspended somewhere about her person by a long, narrow ribbon. Edna removed her collar and opened her dress at the throat. She took the fan from Madame Ratiganole and began to fan both herself and her companion. It was very warm, and for a while they did nothing but exchange remarks about the heat, the sun, the glare. But there was a breeze blowing, a choppy, stiff wind that whipped the water into froth. It fluttered the skirts of the 2 women and kept them for a while engaged in adjusting, readjusting, tucking in, securing hairpins and hatpins. A few persons were sporting some distance away in the water. The beach was very still of human sound at that hour. The lady in black was reading her morning devotions on the porch of the neighboring bathhouse. 2 young lovers were exchanging their hearts' yearnings beneath the children's tent, which they had found unoccupied. Does that just mean they're fucking? Anyways. Edna Pontellier, casting her eyes about, had finally kept them at rest upon the sea. The day was clear and carried the gaze out as far as the blue sky went. There were a few white clouds suspended idly over the horizon. A lateen sail was visible in the direction of Cat Island, and others to the south seemed almost motionless in the far distance. Of what are you thinking?" asked Adele of her companion, whose countenance she had been watching with little amused attention, arrested by the absorbed expression which seemed to have seized and fixed every feature into a statuesque repose. "Nothing," returned Mrs. Pontellier, with a start, adding at once, "How stupid. But it seems to me it is the reply we make instinctively to such a question. Let me see." She went on, throwing back her head and narrowing her fine eyes till they shone like 2 vivid points of light. "Let me see. I was really not conscious of thinking of anything, but perhaps I can retrace my thoughts." "Oh, never mind," laughed Madame Ratiganole. "I'm not quite so exacting. I will let you off this time. It is really too hot to think, especially to think about thinking." "But for the fun of it," persisted Edna. "First of all, the sight of the water stretching so far away, those motionless sails against the blue sky, made a delicious picture that I just wanted to sit and look at. The hot wind beating my face made me think, without any connection that I can trace, of a summer day in Kentucky, of a meadow that seemed as big as the ocean to the very little girl walking through the grass, which was higher than her waist. She threw out her arms as if swimming when she walked, beating the tall grass as one strikes out in the water. Oh, I see the connection now." "Where were you going that day in Kentucky, walking through the grass?" "I don't remember now. I was just walking diagonally across a big field. My sunbonnet obstructed the view. I can only see the stretch of green before me, and I felt as if I might walk on forever without coming to the end of it. I don't remember whether I was frightened or pleased. I must have been entertained." Likely as not it was Sunday, she laughed, and I was running away from prayers from the Presbyterian service, read in a spirit of gloom by my father that chills me yet to think of. And have you been running away from prayers ever since, my cher? Asked Madame Retiganoli, amused. No, oh no, Edna hastened to say. I was a little unthinking child in those days, just following a misleading impulse without question. On the contrary, during one period of my life, religion took a firm hold upon me, after I was 12 until, well, I suppose until now. Though I never thought much about it, just driven along by habit. But do you know, she broke off, turning her quick eyes upon Madame Ratigarole, and leaning forward a little, so as to bring her face quite close to that of her companion. Sometimes I feel this summer as if I were walking through the green meadow again, idly, aimlessly, unthinking, and unguided. Madame Ratigarole laid her hand over that of Mrs. Pontellier, which was near her. Seeing that hand was not withdrawn, she clasped it firmly and warmly. She even stroked it a little fondly with her other hand, muttering in an undertone, Pauvre chérie, poor, dear. The action was at first a little confusing to Edna, but she soon lent herself readily to the Creole's gentle caress. She was not accustomed to an outward and spoken expression of affection, either in herself or in others. She and her younger sister Janet had quarreled a good deal through force of unfortunate habit. Her older sister Margaret was matronly and dignified, probably from having assumed matronly and housewifely responsibilities too early in life, their mother having died when they were quite young. Margaret was not effusive, she was practical. Edna had an occasional girlfriend, but whether accidentally or not, they seemed to have all been of one type, self-contained. She never realized that the reserve of her own character had much, perhaps everything, to do with this. Her most intimate friend of school had been one of rather exceptional intellectual gifts, who wrote fine-sounding essays which Edna admired and strove to imitate, and with her she talked and glowed over the English classics and sometimes held religious and political controversies. Fuck yeah. Edna often wondered at one propensity, God fucking damn. Edna often wondered at one propensity which sometimes had inwardly disturbed her without causing any outward show or manifestation on her part. At a very early age, perhaps it was when she had traversed the ocean of waving grass, she remembered that she had been passionately enamored of a dignified and sad-eyed cavalry officer who visited her father in Kentucky. She could not leave his She could not leave his presence when he was there, nor remove her eyes from his face, which was something like Napoleon's. How the fuck would you know that, babe? With the lock of black hair falling across the forehead, but the cavalry officer melted imperceptibly out of her existence. At another time, her affections were deeply engaged by a young gentleman who visited a lady on the neighboring plantation. It was after they went to Mississippi to live. The young man was engaged to be married to the young lady, and they sometimes called upon Margaret, driving over of afternoons in a buggy. Edna was a little miss, just merging into her teens, and the realization that she herself was nothing to the engaged young man was a bitter affliction to her. But he, too, went the way of dreams. She was a grown young woman when she was overtaken by what she supposed to be the climax of her fate. It was when the face and figure of a great tragedian began to haunt her imagination and stir her senses. The persistence of the infatuation lent it an aspect of genuineness. The hopelessness of it colored with the lofty tones of a great passion. The picture of the tragedian stood enframed upon her desk. Anyone may possess a portrait of a tragedian without exciting suspicion or comment. This was a sinister reflection which she cherished. In the presence of others, she expressed admiration for his exalted gifts, as she handed the photograph around and dwelt upon the fidelity of the likeness. When alone, she sometimes picked it up and kissed the cold glass passionately. Damn, bitch! Who's this guy? Her marriage to Léonce Pontellier was purely an accident, in this respect resembling many other marriages which masquerade as the decrees of fate. It was in the midst of her secret great passion that she met him. He fell in love, as men are in the habit of doing, and pressed his suit with an earnestness and an ardor which left nothing to be desired. He pleased her. His absolute devotion flattered her. She fancied there was a sympathy of thought and taste between them, in which fancy she was mistaken. Add to this the violent opposition of her father and her sister Margaret to her marriage with a Catholic. And we need seek no further than for the motives which led her to accept Monsieur Pontellier for her husband. The acme of bliss, which would have been a marriage with the tragedian, was not for her in this world. As the devoted wife of a man who worshipped her, she felt she would take her place with a certain dignity in the world of reality, closing the portals forever behind her upon the realm of romance and dreams. But it was not long before the tragedian had gone to join the cavalry officer, an engaged young man, and a few others, and Edna found herself face to face with the realities. She grew fond of her husband, realizing with some unaccountable satisfaction that no trace of passion or excessive fictitious warmth colored her affection, thereby threatening its dissolution. She was fond of her children in an uneven, impulsive way. She would sometimes gather them passionately to her heart. She would sometimes forget them. The year before, they had spent part of the summer with their grandmother Pontellier in Iberville. Feeling secure regarding their happiness and welfare, she did not miss them except with an occasional intense longing. Their absence was a sort of relief, though she did not admit this, even to herself. It seemed to free her of a responsibility which she had blindly assumed, and for which fate had not fitted her. Edna did not reveal so much as all this to Madame Ratiganoli that summer day, when they sat with faces turned to the sea. But a good part of it escaped her. She had put her head down on Madame Ratiganoli's shoulder. She was flushed and felt intoxicated with the sound of her own voice and the unaccustomed taste of candor. It muddled her like wine or like the first breath of freedom. There was the sound of approaching voices. It was Robert, surrounded by a troop of children searching for them. The two little Pontelliers were with him, and he carried Madame Ratiganoli's little girl in his arms. There were other children beside, and two nursemaids followed, looking disagreeable and resigned. Ouch. The women at once rose and began to shake out their draperies and relax their muscles. Mrs. Pontellier threw the cushions and rug into the bathhouse. The children all scampered off to the awning, and they stood there in the line, gazing upon the intruding lovers, still exchanging their vows and sighs. The lovers got up, only with a silent protest, and walked slowly away somewhere else. Hey, yo, stop fucking, there's kids around. The children possessed themselves of the tent, and Mrs. Pontellier went over to join them. Madame Ratiganoli begged Robert to accompany her to the house. She complained of a cramp in her limbs and stiffness of the joints. She leaned draggedly upon his arm as they walked. I gotta piss real quick. I'll be back. One sec. Why did the nice library jazz turn off? Library jazz turned back on. Oh, library jazz. Thank you. Wait. What does the Pomodoro bit mean? It's just a break. I don't understand what that means. Whatever. Subway Surfer still going. Slay! Anyways. Damn it, there's more freaking French. God. Leave me alone, French people. Ice cream. Ice cream. Hold up, I'm trying to set my phone up. There we go. Yeah, it's doing the fun little thing. Okay. Uh-oh. Damn it! Fuck. Alright, one fucking second. Yay! Which one was that? At least they told me. Sorry, I got a job application denial. Hooray! Which one is that? Electrophysiology? Whatever. At least it's one of the ones I applied for in fucking October. Unless it's the more recent one. I'll be mad if it's that one. Did I apply for that shit twice? Lol. Hold up. 1 sec. Johnson. And Johnson. Come on, please be the October one and not the one I did in January. Please. It's the October one, God bless. Let's go. Good shit. They listed it twice, man. Not my fault. Welp, that's one more off the list of fucking 61. No, 60. Not 61, but still. I love applying for jobs. It's so fun. I gotta move this. It's not fucking... Why doesn't it... Whatever, man. I don't care. Okay. Thanks, phone, for telling me. Alright. Uh-oh. I'm gonna imagine that this lady is very New Orleans, and I'm gonna try to do it in full earnest. A New Orleans accent. Do me a favor, Robert, spoke the pretty woman at his side, almost as soon as she and Robert had started their slow homeward way. She looked up in his face, leaning on his arm beneath an encircled shadow of the umbrella which he had lifted. Granted, as many as you like, he returned, glancing down into her eyes that were full of thoughtfulness and speculation. Oh, wait, 1 sec. This is loud, I realized. It's not that loud. I only ask for one. Let Mrs. Pontellier alone. 10, he exclaimed with a sudden boyish laugh. Voilà que Madame Ratiganolle est jaloux. She's jealous. Nonsense. I'm in earnest. I mean what I say. Let Mrs. Pontellier alone. Why? He asked, himself growing serious at his companion's solicitation. She is not one of us. She is not like us. She might make the unfortunate blunder of taking you seriously. His face flushed with annoyance, and taking off his soft hat, he began to beat it impatiently against his leg as he walked. Why shouldn't she take me seriously? He demanded sharply. Am I a comedian, a clown, a jack-in-the-box? Why shouldn't she? You Creoles, I have no patience with you. Am I always to be regarded as a feature of an amusing program? I hope Miss Pontellier does take me seriously. I hope she has discernment enough to find me something besides the blague. If I thought there was any doubt... Oh, enough, Robert! She broke into his heated outburst. You are not thinking of what you're saying. You speak about as little reflection as we might expect from one of those children down there playing in the sand. If your attentions to any married woman here were ever offered with any intention of being convincing, you would not be the gentleman we all know you to be, and you would be unfit to associate with the wives and daughters of the people who trust you. Madame Ratiganole had spoken what she believed to be the law and gospel. The young man shrugged his shoulders impatiently. Oh, well, that isn't it, slamming his hat. Oh, well, that isn't it, slamming his hat down vehemently upon his head. You ought to feel that such things are not flattering to say to a fellow. Should our whole intercourse consist of an exchange of compliments? Ma foi. It isn't pleasant to have a woman tell you, he went on, unheedingly, but breaking off suddenly. Now, if I was like a Robin, you remember Alcea Robin and that story of the consul's wife in Biloxi? And he related the story of Alcea Robin and the consul's wife, and another about the tenor of the French opera, who received letters which should never have been written, and still other stories, grave and gay, till Mrs. Pontellier and her possible propensity for taking young men seriously was apparently forgotten. Madame Ratiganole, when they regained her cottage, went in to take an hour's rest, which she considered helpful. Before leaving her, Robert begged her pardon for the impatience, he called it rudeness, with which he had received her well-meant caution. You make one mistake, Adele, he said with a light smile. There is no earthly possibility of Mrs. Pontellier ever taking me seriously. You should have warned me against taking myself seriously. Your advice might then have carried some weight and given me subject for some reflection. Au revoir. But you look tired, he added solicitously. Would you like a cup of bouillon? Shall I stir you a toddy? Let me mix you a toddy with a drop of agnostra. She acceded to the suggestion of bouillon, which was grateful and acceptable. He went himself to the kitchen, which was a building apart from the cottages and lying to the rear of the house. As he himself brought her the golden brown bouillon in a dainty Sevres cup, with a flaky cracker or two on a saucer. Nice queen. She thrust a bare white arm from the curtain which shielded her open door and received the cup from his hands. She told him he was a bon garçon. Bon garçon. Garçon. And she meant it. Robert thanked her and turned away towards the house. The lovers were just entering the grounds of the pension. They were leaning towards each other as the water oaks bent from the sea. There was not a particle of earth beneath their feet. Jesus. Their heads might have been turned upside down, so absolutely did they tread upon blue ether. The lady in black, creeping behind them, looked a trifle paler and more jaded than usual. There was no sign of Mrs. Pontellier and the children. Robert scanned the distance for any such apparition. They would doubtless remain away until the dinner hour. The young man ascended to his mother's room. It was situated at the top of the house, made up of odd angles and a queer sloping ceiling. 2 broad dormer windows looked out towards the gulf, and as far across it as a man's eye might reach. The furnishings of the room were light, cool, and practical. Madame Lebrun was busily engaged at the sewing machine. A little black girl sat on the floor, and with her hands worked the treadle of the machine. Right, well, there we are. The Creole woman does not take any chances which may be avoided of imperiling her health. Robert went over and seated himself on the broad sill of one of the dormer windows. He took a book from his pocket and began energetically to read it, judging by the precision and frequency with which he turned the leaves. The sewing machine made a resounding clatter in the room. It was of a ponderous bygone make. In the lulls, Robert and his mother exchanged bits of desultory conversation. "Where's Miss Pontellier?" "Down at the beach with the children." "I promised to lend her the Goncourt. Don't forget to take it down when you go. It's there on the bookshelf over the small table." Clatter, 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 bang for the next 5 or 8 minutes. "Where's Victor going with the Rockaway?" "The Rockaway? Victor?" "Yes, down there in front. He seems to be getting ready to drive away somewhere." "Call him." Clatter, clatter. Robert uttered a shrill, piercing whistle which might have been heard back at the wharf. He won't look up. Madame Lebrun flew to the window. She yelled, "Victor!" She waved a handkerchief and called again. The young fellow below got into the vehicle and started the horse off with a gallop. At a gallop. Madame Lebrun went back to the machine, crimson with annoyance. Victor was the younger son and brother. Titemonte? I don't fucking know. With a temper which invited violence and a will no axe could break. Whenever you say the word, I'm ready to thrash any amount of reason into him that he's able to hold. If your father had only lived, clatter, 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 bang, it was a fixed belief that Madame Lebrun was the conduct of the universe, and all things pertaining thereto would have been manifestly of a more intelligent and higher order had not Monsieur Lebrun been removed to the other spheres during the early years of their married life. What do you hear from Montel? Montel was the middle-aged gentleman whose vain ambition and desire for the past 20 years had been to fill up the void which Monsieur Lebrun's house, taking off, had left in the Lebrun household. Clatter, bang, clatter, clatter, bang, clatter. I have a letter somewhere. Looking in the machine drawer and finding the letter in the bottom of the work basket. He says to tell you he will be in Veracruz in the beginning of next month, clatter, clatter. And if you still have the intention of joining him, bang, clatter, clatter, bang. Why didn't you tell me so before, Mother? You know I wanted, clatter, clatter, clatter. Do you see Mrs. Pontellier starting back with the children? She'll be late to luncheon again. She never starts to get ready for lunch until the last minute, clatter, clatter. Where are you going? Where did you say Goncourt was? Every light in the hall was ablaze. Every lamp... Oh, wait, I want ice cream first. 1 second. 1 second. Yummy. It's Americone Dream, Ben & Jerry's. It's quite good. Anyways. Oh shit. It's blocked off. Oh fuck. Not filters. Properties. No. Wait. What the fuck is it? Transform. Edit transform. 750. 700. Done. There we go. Now we can read it. Y'all welcome. What the fuck? Did I change it to 70? Shit. Transform. I changed it to 70. I'm fucking stupid. Cool. Alright. Let's go. Every light in the hall was ablaze. Every lamp turned as high as it could be without smoking the chimney or threatening explosion. The lamps were fixed at intervals against the wall, encircling the whole room. Someone had gathered orange and lemon branches, and with those fashioned graceful festoons between. The dark green of the branches stood out and glistened against the white muslin curtains which draped the windows, and which puffed, floated, and flapped at the capricious will of a stiff breeze that swept up from the Gulf. It was Saturday night, a few weeks after the intimate conversation held between Robert and Madame Braccianole on their way from the beach. An unusual number of husbands, fathers, and friends had come down to stay over Sunday, and they were being suitably entertained by their families, with the material help of Madame Lebrun. Lebrun. I have to say Braccianole like that and Lebrun like that. I've decided. The dining tables had all been removed to one end of the hall, and the chairs ranged about in rows and in clusters. Each little family group had had its say and exchanged its domestic gossip earlier in the evening. There was now an apparent disposition to relax, to widen the circle of confidences, and give a more general tone to the conversation. Many of the children had been permitted to sit up beyond their usual bedtime. A small band of them were lying on their stomachs on the floor, looking at the colored sheets of comic paper which Mr. Pontellier had brought down. The little Pontellier boys were permitting them to do so, and making their authority felt. Music, dancing, and a recitation of the two were the entertainments furnished, or rather offered, but there was nothing systematic about the program, no appearance of prearrangement, nor even premeditation. At an early hour in the evening, the Farival twins were prevailed upon to play the piano. They were girls of 14, always clad in the Virgin's colors, blue and white, having been dedicated to the Blessed Virgin at their baptism. They played a duet from Zampa, and at the earnest solicitation of everyone present, followed it with the overture to the poet and the peasant. Allez-vous-en, sapristi, shrieked the parrot outside the door. He was the only being present who possessed sufficient candor to admit that he was not listening to these gracious performances for the first time that summer. Old Monsieur Farival, the grandfather of the twins, grew indignant over the interruption and insisted upon having the bird removed and consigned to the regions of darkness. Victor Lachouan objected, and his decrees were as immutable as those of fate. The parrot fortunately offered no further interruption to the entertainment, the whole venom of his nature apparently having been cherished up and hurled against the twins in that one impetuous outburst. Oy vey. Later, a young brother and sister gave recitations, which everyone present had heard many times at winter evening entertainments in the city. A little girl performed a skirt dance in the center of the floor. The mother played her accompaniments and at the same time watched her daughter with greedy admiration and nervous apprehension. She need have had no apprehension. The child was mistress of the situation. She had been properly dressed for the occasion in black tulle and black silk tights. Her little neck and arms were bare. Her hair, artificially crimped, stood out like fluffy black plumes over her head. Her poses were full of grace, and her little black shod toes twinkled as they shot out and upward with a rapidity and suddenness which were bewildering. There was no reason why everyone should not dance. Madame Ratiganole could not, so it was she who gaily consented to play for the others. She played very well, keeping excellent waltz time and infusing an expression into the strains, which was indeed inspiring. She was keeping up her music on account of the children, she said, because she and her husband both considered it a means of brightening the home and making it attractive. Almost everyone danced but the twins, who could not be induced to separate during a brief period when one or the other should be whirling around the room in the arms of a man. They might have danced together, but they did not think of it. The children were sent to bed, some went submissively, others with shrieks and protests as they were dragged away. They had been permitted to sit up till after the ice cream, which naturally marked the limit of human indulgence. The ice cream was passed around with cake, gold and silver cake, arranged on platters in alternate slices. It had been made and frozen during the afternoon back of the kitchen by two black women, under the supervision of Victor. It was pronounced a great success, excellent if it had only contained a little less vanilla or a little more sugar, if it had been frozen a degree harder, and if the salt might have been kept out of portions of it. Victor was proud of his achievement, and went about recommending it and urging everyone to partake of it to excess. After Mrs. Pontellier had danced twice with her husband, once with Robert, and once with Monsieur Ratiganole, who was thin and tall and swayed like a reed in the wind when he danced, she went out on the gallery and seated herself on the low window-sill, where she commanded a view of all that went on in the hall, and could look out towards the gulf. Jesus. There was a soft effulgence in the east. The moon was coming up, and its mystic shimmer was casting a million lights across the distant, restless water. "Would you like to hear Mademoiselle Ray's play?" asked Robert, coming out on the porch where she was. Of course Edna would like to hear Mademoiselle Ray's play, but she feared it would be useless to entreat her. "I'll ask her," he said. "I'll tell her what you want to hear." "I'll tell her that you want to hear her. She likes you. She will come." He turned and hurried away to one of the far cottages where Mademoiselle Reisz was shuffling away. She was dragging a chair in and out of her room, and at intervals objecting to the crying of a baby, which a nurse in the adjoining cottage was endeavoring to put to sleep. She was a disagreeable little woman, no longer young, who had quarreled with almost everyone, owing to a temper which was self-assertive and a disposition to trample upon the rights of others. Robert prevailed upon her without any too great difficulty. Ice cream. Nom. Shit. Yummy. Okay. She entered the hall with him during a lull in the dance. She made an awkward, imperious little bow as she went in. She was a homely woman, with a small, weazened face and body and eyes that glowed. She had absolutely no taste in dress, and wore a batch of rusty black lace with a bunch of artificial violets pinned to the side of her hair. "Ask Mrs. Pontellier what she would like to hear me play," she requested of Robert. She sat perfectly still before the piano, not touching the keys, while Robert carried her message to Edna in the window. A general air of surprise and genuine satisfaction fell upon everyone as they saw the pianist enter. There was a settling down and a prevailing air of expectancy everywhere. Edna was a trifle embarrassed at being thus signaled out for the imperious little woman's favor. She would not dare to choose and begged that Mademoiselle Reisz would please herself in her selections. Edna was what she herself called very fond of music. Musical strains, well rendered, had a way of evoking pictures in her mind. She sometimes liked to sit in the room of mornings when Mademoiselle Ratiganole played or practiced. One piece which that lady played Edna had entitled Solitude. It was a short, plaintive minor strain. The name of the piece was something else, but she called it Solitude. When she heard it, there came before her imagination the figure of a man standing beside a desolate rock on the seashore. Jesus. He was naked. His attitude was one of hopeless resignation as he looked toward a distant bird winging his flight away from him. Freaky. Another piece called to her mind a dainty young woman clad in an empire gown, taking mincing dancing steps as she came down a long avenue between tall hedges. Again, another reminded her of children at play, and still another of nothing on earth but a demure lady stroking a cat. The very first chords which Mademoiselle Reisz played struck upon the piano sent a keen tremor down Mrs. Pontellier's spinal column. It was not the first time she had heard an artist at the piano. Perhaps it was the first time she was ready, perhaps the first time her being was tempered to take an impress of the abiding truth. She waited for the material pictures which she thought would gather and blaze before her imagination. She waited in vain. She saw no pictures of solitude, of hope, of longing, or of despair, but the very passions themselves were aroused within her soul, swaying it, lashing it, as the waves daily beat upon her splendid body. She trembled, she was choking, and the tears blinded her. Mademoiselle had finished. She arose, and bowing her stiff, lofty bow, she went away, stopping for neither thanks nor applause. As she passed along the gallery, she patted Edna upon the shoulder. "Well, how do you like my music?" she asked. The young woman was unable to answer. She pressed the hand of the pianist convulsively. Mademoiselle Reisz perceived her agitation and even her tears. She patted her again upon the shoulder, as she said, "You are the only one worth playing for. Those others, bah!" And she went shuffling and sidling down the gallery toward her own room. But she was mistaken about those others. Her playing had aroused a fever of enthusiasm. What passion! What an artist! I have always said no one could play Chopin. I never know how to fucking say his name. I always say Chopin. No one could play Chopin like Mademoiselle Reisz. The last prelude, bon Dieu, it shakes the man. It was growing late, and there was a general disposition to disband. But someone, perhaps it was Robert, thought of a bath at that mystic hour and under that mystic moon. One more bite of ice cream, I'm putting it away. Not me. One time. Fuck. Shit. Oh no. Okay, I got it. I dropped the lid, I fear. Alright. Okay. At all events, Robert proposed it, and there was not a dissenting voice. There was not one but was ready to follow when he led the way. He did not lead the way, however, he directed the way, and he himself loitered behind with the lovers, who had betrayed a disposition to linger and hold themselves apart. He walked between them, whether with malicious or mischievous intent was not wholly clear, even to himself. The Pontelliers and Ratignolles walked ahead, the women leaning upon the arms of their husbands. Edna could hear Robert's voice behind them, and could sometimes hear what he said. She wondered why he did not join them. It was unlike him not to. Of late he had sometimes held away from her for an entire day, redoubling his devotion upon the next and the next, as though to make up for hours that had been lost. She missed him the days when some pretext served to take him away from her, just as one misses the sun on a cloudy day without having thought much about the sun when it was shining. The people walked in little groups towards the beach. They talked and laughed, some of them sang. There was a band playing down at Klein's hotel, and the strains reached them faintly, tempered by the distance. There were strange, rare odors abroad, a tangle of the sea smell and of weeds and damp, new plowed earth mingled with the heavy perfume of a field of white blossoms somewhere near. But the night sat lightly upon the sea and the land. There was no weight of darkness, there were no shadows. The white light of the moon had fallen upon the world like the mystery and the softness of sleep. Most of them walked into the water as though into a native element. The sea was quiet now, and it swelled lazily in broad billows that melted into one another and did not break except upon the beach in little foamy crests that coiled back like slow white serpents. Edna had attempted all summer to learn to swim. She'd received instructions from both men and women, and in some instances from children. Robert had pursued the system of lessons almost daily, and he was nearly at the point of discouragement in realizing the futility of his efforts. A certain ungovernable dread hung about her when in the water, unless there was a hand nearby that might reach out and reassure her. But that night she was like a little tottering, stumbling, clutching child who of a sudden realized its powers and walks for the first time alone, boldly and with overconfidence. She could have shouted for joy. She did not shout for joy, as with a sweeping stroke or two she lifted her body to the surface of the water. A feeling of exultation overtook her, as if some power of significant import had been given her to control the working of her body and her soul. She grew daring and reckless, overestimating her strength. She wanted to swim far out, where no woman had swum before. Her unlooked-for achievement was the subject of wonder, applause, and admiration. Each one congratulated himself that his special teachings had accomplished this desired end. "How easy it is," she thought. "It's nothing." She said aloud, "Why did I not discover before that it was nothing? Think of the time I've lost splashing about like a baby." She would not join the groups in their sports and bouts, but intoxicated with their newly conquered powers, she swam out alone. She turned her face seaward to gather in an impression of space and solitude, which the vast expanse of water, meeting and melting with the moonlit sky, conveyed her excited fancy. As she swam, she seemed to be reaching out for the unlimited in which to lose herself. Once she had turned and looked towards the shore, towards the people she had left there. She had not gone any great distance, that is, what would have been a great distance for an experienced swimmer. But to her unaccustomed vision, the stretch of water behind her assumed the aspect of a barrier, which her unaided strength would never be able to overcome. A quick vision of death smote her soul, and for a second of time appalled and enfeebled her senses. But by an effort she rallied her staggering faculties and managed to regain the land. She made no mention of her encounter with death in her flash of terror, except to say to her husband, "I thought I should have perished out there alone." "You were not very far, my dear. I was watching you," he told her. Edna went at once to the bathhouse, and she had put on her dry clothes and was ready to return home before the others had left the water. She started to walk away alone. They all called to her and shouted to her. She waved a dissenting hand and went on, paying no further heed to their renewed cries which sought to detain her. "Sometimes I'm tempted to think that Mrs. Pontellier is capricious," said Madame Lebrun, who was amusing herself immensely and feared that Edna's abrupt departure might put an end to the pleasure. "I know she is," assented Mr. Pontellier. "Sometimes, not often." Edna had not traversed the quarter of the distance on her way home before she was overtaken by Robert. "Did you think I was afraid?" she asked him, without a shade of annoyance. "No, I knew you weren't afraid." "Then why did you come? Why didn't you stay out there with the others?" "I never thought of it." "Thought of what?" Of anything. What difference does it make? I'm very tired, she uttered complainingly. I know you are. You don't know anything about it. Why should you know? I never was so exhausted in my life, but it isn't unpleasant. 1,000 emotions have swept through me tonight. I don't comprehend half of them. Don't mind what I'm saying, I'm just thinking aloud. I wonder if I shall ever be stirred again as Mademoiselle Ray's. His search has always hitherto been fruitless, and he has sunk back disheartened into the sea. But tonight he found Mrs. Pontellier. Perhaps he will never wholly release her from the spell. Perhaps she will never again suffer a poor, unworthy earthling to walk in the shadow of her divine presence. Don't banter me, she said, wounded at what appeared to be his flippancy. He didn't mind the entreaty, but the tone, with its delicate note of pathos, was like a reproach. He could not explain. He could not tell her that he had penetrated her mood and understood. He said nothing except to offer his arm, and her arm, for, by her own admission, she was exhausted. She had been walking alone with her arms hanging limp, letting her white skirts trail along the dewy path. She took his arm, but she did not lean upon it. She let her hand lie listlessly, as though her thoughts were elsewhere, somewhere in advance of her body, and she was striving to overtake them. Robert assisted her into the hammock which swung from the post before her door, out to the trunk of a tree. Will you stay out here and wait for Mr. Pontellier? I'll stay out here. Good night. Shall I get you a pillow? There's one here, she said, feeling about, for they were in the shadow. It must be soiled. The children have been tumbling it about. No matter. And having discovered the pillow, she adjusted it beneath her head. She extended herself in the hammock with a deep breath of relief. She was not a supercilious or an over-dainty woman. She was not much given to reclining in the hammock, and when she did so, it was with no cat-like suggestion of voluptuous ease, but with beneficent repose, which seemed to invade her whole body. Shall I stay with you until Mr. Pontellier comes? Asked Robert, seating himself on the outer edge of one of the steps and taking hold of the hammock rope which was fastened to the post. If you wish, don't swing the hammock. Will you get my white shawl which I left over the windowsill over at the house? Are you chilly? No, but I shall be presently. Presently? He laughed. Do you know what time it is? How long are you going to stay out here? I don't know. Will you get the shawl? Of course I will, he said, rising. Sorry, my brain, I'm like floating in and out of different accents. He went over to the house, walking along the grass. She watched his figure pass in and out of the strips of moonlight. It was past midnight. It was very quiet. When he returned with the shawl, she took it and kept it in her hand. She did not put it around her. Did you say I should stay until Mr. Pontellier came back? I said you might if you wished to. He seated himself again and rolled a cigarette, which he smoked in silence. Silence. Jesus. Neither did Mrs. Pontellier speak. No multitude of words could have been more significant than those moments of silence, or more pregnant than the first felt throbbings of desire. Uh-oh! How long is this fucking thing? How do I... Shit! No way! Damn! We only got page 57? Jesus Christ. Fucking bitch. What are you doing out here, Edna? I thought I should find you lying in bed, said her husband when he discovered her lying there. He had walked up with Madame Lebrun and left her at the house. His wife did not reply. Are you asleep? He asked, bending down close to look at her. No. Her eyes gleamed bright and intense, with no sleepy shadows as they looked into his. Do you know it's past 1 o'clock? Come on. And he mounted the steps and went into their room. Edna, called Mr. Pontellier from within, after a few moments had gone by. Don't wait for me, she answered. He thrust his head through the door. You will take a cold out there, he said irritably. What folly is this? Why don't you come in? It isn't cold. I have my shawl. The mosquitoes will devour you. There are no mosquitoes. She heard him moving about the room, every sound indicating his impatience and irritation. Another time she would have gone in at his request. She would, through habit, have yielded to his desire. Not with any sense of submission or obedience to his compelling wishes, but unthinkably, as we walk, move, sit, stand, go through daily treadmill of the life which had been proportioned out to us. "Edna, dear, are you not coming in soon?" he asked again, this time fondly, with a note of entreaty. "No, I'm going to stay out here." "This is more than folly," he blurted out. "I can't permit you to stay out there all night. You must come into the house instantly." With a writhing motion, she settled herself more securely in the hammock. She perceived that her will had blazed up, stubborn and resistant. She could not at that moment have done other than denied and resisted. She wondered if her husband had ever spoken to her like that before, and if she had submitted to his command. Of course she had. She remembered that she had, but she could not realize why or how she could have yielded. She should have yielded, feeling as she then did. "Leonce, go to bed," she said. "I mean to stay out here. I don't wish to go in, and I don't intend to. Don't speak to me like that again. I shall not answer you." Mr. Pontellier had prepared for bed, but he slipped on an extra garment. He opened a bottle of wine, of which he kept a small and select supply in a buffet of his own. He drank a glass of wine and then went out on the gallery and offered a glass to his wife. She did not wish any. He drew up the rocker, hoisted his slippered feet onto the rail, and proceeded to smoke a cigar. He smoked 2 cigars. Then he went inside and drank another glass of wine. Mrs. Pontellier again declined to accept a glass when it was offered to her. Mr. Pontellier once more seated himself with elevated feet, and after a reasonable interval of time, smoked more cigars. Ew. Edna began to feel like one who awakens gradually out of a dream, a delicious, grotesque, impossible dream, to feel again the realities pressing into her soul. The physical need for sleep began to overtake her. The exuberance which had sustained and exalted her spirit left her helpless and yielding to the conditions which crowded her in. The stillest hour of night had come, the hour before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath. The moon hung low and had turned from silver to copper in the sleeping sky. The old owl no longer hooted, and the water oaks ceased to moan as they bent their heads. Edna arose, cramped from lying so long and still in the hammock. She tottered up the steps, clutching feebly at the post before passing into the house. "Are you coming in, Leonce?" she asked, turning her face towards her husband. "Yes, dear," he answered, with a glance following a misty puff of smoke, "just as soon as I have finished my cigar." She slept but a few hours. They were troubled and feverish hours, disturbed with dreams that were intangible, that eluded her, leaving only an impression upon her half-awakened senses of something unattainable. She was up and dressed in the cool of the early morning. The air was invigorating and steadied somewhat her faculties. Goddamn, different word. However, she was not seeking refreshment or help from any source, either external or from within. She was blindly following whatever impulse moved her, as if she had placed herself in alien hands for direction, and freed her soul of responsibility. Most of the people at that early hour were still in bed and asleep. A few, who intended to go to Chenier for Mass, were moving about. The lovers, who had laid their plans the night before, were already strolling toward the wharf. The lady in black, with her Sunday prayer book, velvet and gold clasped, and her Sunday silver beads, was following them at no great distance. Old Monsieur Farival was up, and was more than half inclined to do anything that suggested itself. He put on his big straw hat, and taking his umbrella from the stand in the hall, followed the lady in black, never overtaking her. The little black girl who worked Madame Lebrun's sewing machine was sweeping the galleries with long, absent-minded strokes of the broom. Edna sent her up to the house to awaken Robert. "Tell him I'm going to the Chenier. The boat is ready. Tell him to hurry." He had soon joined her. She had never sent for him before. She had never asked for him. She had never seemed to want him before. She did not appear conscious that she had done anything unusual in commanding his presence. He was apparently equally unconscious of anything extraordinary in the situation, but his face was suffused with a quiet glow when he met her. They went together back to the kitchen to drink coffee. There was no time to wait for any nicety of service. They stood outside the window, and the cook passed them their coffee and a roll, which they drank and ate from the windowsill. Edna said it tasted good. She had not thought of coffee nor of anything. He had told her that he had often noticed that she lacked forethought. "Wasn't it enough to think of going to the Chenier and waking you up?" She laughed. "Do I have to think of everything? As Leonce says when he's in a bad humor, I don't blame him. He'd never be in a bad humor if it weren't for me." They took a shortcut across the sands. At a distance, they could see the curious procession moving toward the wharf, the lovers shoulder to shoulder, creeping, the lady in black gaining steadily upon them, old Monsieur Farival losing ground inch by inch, and a young barefooted Spanish girl with a red kerchief on her head and basket in her arm bringing up the rear. Robert knew the little girl, and he had talked to her a little in the boat. No one present understood what they said. Her name was Mariquita. She had a round, sly, piquant face and pretty black eyes. Her hands were small, and she kept them folded over the handle of her basket. Her feet were broad and coarse. She did not strive to hide them. Edna looked at her feet and noticed the sand and slime between her brown toes. Beaudelet grumbled because Mariquita was there, taking up so much room. In reality, he was annoyed at having old Monsieur Farival, who considered himself the better sailor of the two, but he would not quarrel with so old a man as Monsieur Farival, so he quarreled with Mariquita. The girl was depreciatory at one moment, appealing to Robert. She was saucy the next, moving her head up and down, making eyes at Robert and making mouths at Beaudelet. The lovers were all alone. They saw nothing, they heard nothing. The lady in black was counting her beads for a third time. Old Monsieur Farival talked incessantly of what he knew about handling a boat, and of what Beaudelet did not know on the same subject. Edna liked it all. She looked Mariquita up and down, from her ugly brown toes to her pretty black eyes, and back again. "Why does she look like that?" inquired the girl of Robert. "Maybe she thinks you are pretty, shall I ask her?" "No. Is she your sweetheart?" "She's a married lady, and has 2 children. "Oh, well, Francisco ran away with Silvano's wife, who had 4 children. They took all his money and one of the children and stole his boat." "Shut up. Does she understand?" "Oh, hush. Are those 2 married over there, leaning on each other?" "Of course not," laughed Robert. "Of course not," echoed Mariquita, with a serious confirmatory bob of the head. The sun was high up and beginning to bite. Did she end? She did not end. Good. Uh-oh. What does my phone... Oh, never mind. My phone lies. The swift breeze seemed to Edna to bury the sting of it into the pores of her face and hands. Robert held his umbrella over her. As they went cutting sidewise through the water, the sails bellied taut, with the wind filling and overflowing them. Old Monsieur Farival laughed sardonically at something as he looked at the sails, and Beaudelet swore at the old man under his breath. Sailing across the bay at the Cheniere Caminada, Edna felt as if she were being borne away from some anchorage which held her fast, whose chains had been loosening, and snapped the night before when the mystic spirit was abroad, leaving her free to drift whithersoever she chose to set her sails. Robert spoke to her incessantly. He no longer noticed Mariquita. The girl had shrimps in her bamboo basket. They were covered with Spanish moss. She beat the moss down impatiently and muttered to herself sullenly, "Let us go to the Grand Terre tomorrow?" said Robert in a low voice. "What shall we do there?" "Climb up the hill to the old fort and look at the little wriggling gold snakes and watch the lizards sun themselves." She gazed away towards the Grand Terre and thought that she would like to be alone there with Robert, in the sun, listening to the ocean's roar and watching the slimy lizards writhe in and out among the ruins of the old fort. "And the next day or the next we can sail to the Bayou Brunlo," he went on. "What shall we do there?" "Anything. Cast bait for fish." "No, we'll go back to the Grand Terre. Let the fish alone." "We'll go wherever you like," he said. "I'll have Tony come over and help me patch and trim my boat. We shall not need Beaudelet nor anyone. Are you afraid of the pirogue?" "Oh, no. Then I'll take you some night in the pirogue when the moon shines. Maybe your Gulf spirit will whisper to you in which of these islands the treasures are hidden, direct you to the very spot, perhaps." "And in a day we should be rich," she laughed. "I'd give it all to you, the pirate gold and every bit of treasure we could dig up. I think you would know how to spend it. Pirate gold is nothing to be hoarded or utilized. It's something to squander and throw to the 4 winds for the fun of seeing the golden specks fly." "We'll share it and scatter it together," he said, his face flushed. They all went together up to the quaint little Gothic church of Our Lady of Lourdes, gleaming all brown and yellow with paint in the sun's glare. Only Beaudelet remained behind, tinkering at his boat, and Mariquita walked away with her basket of shrimps, casting a look of childish ill-humor and reproach at Robert from the corner of her eye. A feeling of oppression and drowsiness overcame Edna during the service. Her head began to ache, and the lights on the altar swayed before her eyes. Another time she might have made an effort to regain her composure, but her one thought was to quit the stifling atmosphere of the church and reach the open air. She arose, climbing over Robert's feet with a muttered apology. Old Monsieur Farival, fluttered, curious, stood up, but upon seeing that Robert had followed Mrs. Pontellier, he sank back into his seat. He whispered an anxious inquiry of the lady in black, who did not notice him or reply, but kept her eyes fastened upon the pages of her velvet prayer book. I felt giddy and almost overcome, Edna said, lifting her hands instinctively to her head and pushing her straw hat up from her forehead. I couldn't have stayed through the service. They were outside in the shadow of the church. Robert was full of solicitude. It was folly to have thought of going in the first place, let alone staying. Come over to Madame Antoine's. You can rest there. He took her arm and led her away, looking anxiously and continuously down her face. How still it was, with only the voice of the sea whispering through the reeds that grew in saltwater pools. The long line of little gray, weather-beaten houses nestled peacefully among the orange trees. It must always have been God's day on that low, drowsy island, Edna thought. They stopped, leaning over a jagged fence made of sea drift, to ask for water. A youth, a mild-faced Acadian, was drawing water from the cistern, which was nothing more than a rusty buoy, with an opening on one side sunk into the ground. The water which the youth handed to them in the tin pail was not cold to taste, but was cool to her heated face, and greatly revived and refreshed her. Madame Antoine's cot was at the far end of the village. She welcomed them with all native hospitality, as she would have opened her door to let the sunlight in. She was fat, and walked heavily and clumsily across the floors. She could speak no English, but when Robert made her understand that the lady who accompanied him was ill and desired to rest, she was all eagerness to make Edna feel at home and to dispose of her comfortably. The whole place was immaculately clean, and the big four-posted bed, snow white, invited one to repose. It stood in a small side room which looked out across the narrow grass plot toward the shed, where there was a disabled boat lying keel upward. Madame Antoine had not gone to Mass. Her son Tony had, but she supposed he would soon be back, and she invited Robert to be seated and wait for him. But he went and sat outside the door and smoked. Madame Antoine busied herself in the large front room preparing dinner. She was boiling mullets over a few red coals in the huge fireplace. Edna, left alone in the little side room, loosened her clothes, removing the greater part of them. She bathed her face, her neck and arms in the basin that stood between the windows. She took off her shoes and stockings and stretched herself in the very center of the high white bed. How luxurious it felt to rest thus in a strange, quaint bed, and with a street country odor of laurel lingering about in the sheets and mattress. She stretched her strong limbs that ached a little. She ran her fingers through her loosened hair for a while. She looked up at her round arms and she held them straight up and rubbed them one after the other, observing closely, as if it were something she saw for the first time, the fine, firm quality and texture of her flesh. She clasped her hands easily above her head, and then it was thus she fell asleep. She slept lightly at first, half awake and drowsily attentive to the things about her. She could hear Madame Antoine's heavy, scraping tread as she walked back and forth on the sanded floor. Some chickens were clucking outside the windows, scratching for bits of gravel in the grass. Later, she half heard the voices of Robert and Tony talking under the shed. She did not stir. Even her eyelids rested numb and heavily over her sleepy eyes. The voices went on, Tony's slow Acadian drawl, Robert's quick, soft, smooth French. She understood French imperfectly unless directly addressed, and the voices were only part of the other drowsy, muffled sounds, lulling her senses. When Edna awoke, it was with the conviction that she had slept long and soundly. The voices were hushed under the shed. Madame Antoine's step was no longer to be heard in the adjoining room. Even the chickens had gone elsewhere to scratch and cluck. The mosquito bar was drawn over her. The old woman had come in while she slept and let down the bar. Edna rose quietly from the bed, and looking between the curtains of the window, she saw the slanting rays of the sun that the afternoon was far advanced. Robert was out there under the shed, reclining in the shade against the sloping keel of the overturned boat. He was reading from a book. Tony was no longer with him. She wondered what had become of the rest of the party. She peeped out at him 2 or 3 times as she stood washing herself in the little basin between the windows. Madame Antoine had laid some coarse, clean towels upon a chair, and had placed a box of powder de rice powder, within easy reach. Edna dabbed the powder upon her nose and cheeks as she looked at herself closely in the little distorted mirror which hung on the wall above the basin. Her eyes were bright and wide awake, and her face glowed. When she had completed her toilet, she walked into the adjoining room. She was very hungry. No one was there, but there was a cloth spread upon the table that stood against the wall, and a cover was laid for one, with a crusty brown loaf and a bottle of wine beside the plate. Edna bit a piece from the brown loaf, tearing it with her strong white teeth. She poured some wine into the glass and drank it down. Then she went softly out the doors, and plucking an orange from the low-hanging bough of a tree, and threw it at Robert, who did not know she was awake and up. An illumination broke over his whole face when he saw her and joined her underneath the orange tree. "How many years have I slept?" she inquired. "The whole island seems changed. A new race of beings must have sprung up, leaving only you and me as past relics. How many ages ago did Madame Antoine and Tony die? And when did our people from the Grand Isle disappear from the earth?" He familiarly adjusted a ruffle upon her shoulder. "You have slept precisely 100 years. I was left here to guard your slumbers, and for 100 years I have been out under the shed reading a book. The only evil I couldn't prevent was to keep a broiled fowl from drying up. If it had turned to stone, I will eat it," said Edna, moving with him into the house. "Fuck off, American Airlines. Stop emailing me." Whatever. "But really, what has become of Monsieur Farival and the others?" "Gone hours ago. When they found that you were sleeping, they thought it was best not to awake you. Anyway, I wouldn't have let them. What was I here for?" "I wonder if Léonce will be uneasy," she speculated as she seated herself at the table. "Of course not. He knows you're with me," Robert replied as he busied himself among sundry pans and covered dishes which had been left standing on the hearth. Where are Madame Antoine and her son?" asked Edna. "Gone to Vespers and to visit some friends, I believe. I am to take you back in Tony's boat whenever you are ready to go." He stirred the smoldering ashes till the broiled fowl began to sizzle afresh. He served her with no mean repast, drinking the coffee anew and sharing it with her. Madame Antoine had cooked little else than the mullets, but while Edna slept, Robert had foraged the island. He was childishly gratified to discover her appetite, and to see the relish with which she ate the food which he had procured for her. "Shall we go right away?" she asked, after draining her glass and brushing together the crumbs of the crusty loaf. "The sun isn't as low as it will be in 2 hours," he answered. "The sun will be gone in 2 hours." "Well, let it go. Who cares?" They waited a good while under the orange trees, till Madame Antoine came back, panting, waddling, with 1,000 apologies to explain her absence. Tony did not dare return. He was shy. "Stop!" My professor just assigned homework. "And would not willingly face any woman except his mother." That's really funny. It was very pleasant to stay there under the orange trees while the sun dipped lower and lower, turning the western sky to flaming copper and gold. The shadows lengthened and crept out like stealthy, grotesque monsters, across the grass. Edna and Robert both sat upon the ground. That is, he lay upon the ground beside her, occasionally picking at the hem of her muslin gown. Madame Antoine seated her fat body, broad and squat, upon a bench beside the door. "Leave her the fuck alone, dog." She had been talking all morning and had wound herself up to the storytelling pitch. And what story she told them! But twice in her life she had left the Chenier Caminada, and then for the briefest span. All her years she had squatted and waddled there upon the island, gathering legends of the Baratarians and the sea. The night came on, with the moon to lighten it. Edna could hear the whispering voices of dead men and the click of muffled gold. When she and Robert stepped into Tony's boat with the red lantern sail, misty spirit forms were prowling in the shadows and among the reeds, and upon the water were phantom ships speeding to cover. The youngest boy, Etienne, had been very naughty. Madame Ratignolle said, as she delivered him into the hands of his mother. He had been unwilling to go to bed and had made a scene, whereupon she had taken charge of him and pacified him as well as she could. Raoul had been in bed and asleep for 2 hours. The youngster was in his long white nightgown that kept tripping him up as Madame Ratignolle led him along by the hand. With the other chubby fist he rubbed his eyes, which were heavy with sleep and ill humor. Edna took him in her arms and seated herself in the rocker, began to cuddle and caress him, calling him all manner of tender names, soothing him to sleep. It was not more than 9 o'clock. No one had yet gone to bed but the children. Léonce had been very uneasy at first, Madame Ratignolle said, and had wanted to start at once for Chenier. But Monsieur Farival assured him that his wife was only overcome with sleep and fatigue, and that Tony would bring him safely back later that day, and he had thus been dissuaded from crossing the bay. He had gone over to Klein's, looking up some cotton broker whom he wished to see in regard to securities, exchanges, stocks, bonds, or something of the sort. Madame Bratiganole did not remember what. He had said he would not remain away late. Shit. She herself was suffering from heat and depression, she said. She carried a bottle of salts and a large fan. She would not consent to remain with Edna, for Monsieur Ratiganole was alone, and he detested above all things to be left alone. When Etienne had fallen asleep, Edna bore him into the back room, and Robert went and lifted the mosquito bar that she might lay the child comfortably in his bed. The quadroon had vanished. When they emerged from the cottage, Robert bade Edna good night. "Do you know that we have been together the whole livelong day, Robert, since early this morning?" she said at parting. "All but the 100 years when you were sleeping. Good night." He pressed her hand and went away in the direction of the beach. He did not join any of the others, but walked alone towards the gulf. Edna stayed outside, awaiting her husband's return. She had no desire to sleep or to retire, nor did she feel like going over to sit with the Ratiganoles, or to join Madame Lebrun in a group whose animated voices reached her as they sat in conversation before the house. She let her mind wander back over her stay at Grand Isle, and she tried to discover wherein this summer had been different from any and every other summer of her life. She could only realize that she herself, her present self, was in some way different from the other self. That she was seeing with different eyes and making the acquaintance of new conditions in herself that colored and changed her environment. She did not yet suspect. My fucking knee hurts. Oh, shit! When was that? Uh-oh. Sorry, gang. I missed that. Hi, how you doing? Oh, fuck, Sneak Snags live. Damn. Who was that? Who is it? Who is it? Who is it? Hi, Graham. How long ago was that? I'm so sorry. Hi, Graham, if you're seeing this, I love you. I'm sorry. My ass has not been fucking looking. How you doing? I'm sorry. I did not have my phone open. I forgot. I've been deep in book, I fear. It doesn't have a fucking timestamp. That's annoying. Well, anyways, hi, Graham. Mwah. Good to see ya. Oh, my hip hurts. Alright, book time. Again, if Grim comes back, I will see. Inshallah, I will see Grim. Where the fuck was I? She wondered why Robert had gone away and left her. It did not occur to her to think that he might have grown tired of being with her the livelong day. She was not tired, and she felt that he was not. She regretted that he had gone. It was so much more natural to have him stay when he was not absolutely required to leave her. As Edna waited for her husband, she sang low a little song that Robert had sung as they crossed the bay. It began with, "Ah, si tu savais," and every verse ended with, "si tu savais." Robert's voice was not pretentious. It was musical and true. I'm pretending that that's Spanish because I don't fucking care about French. It was musical and true. The voice, the notes, the whole refrain haunted her memory. When Edna entered the dining room one evening a little late, as was her habit, an unusually animated conversation seemed to be going on. Several persons were talking at once, and Victor's voice was predominating, even over that of his mother. Edna had returned late from her bath. I'm moving. BT dubs. One sec. I want to lay down. I need to get my knee above my heart or whatever the fuck. So we're rotating. Rotate though. Rotate. Oh shit. I also need to be out of reach of this fucking bag of marshmallows I have. Because I keep eating them. That's probably bad. Money. Oh wait, I should get ice. class start today? It ends at 7:15, so I think 6, but I could be wrong. I'll check that in a sec. Shit. There's that. And then there is what a noise that was. The fuck was that? Whatever. We race methoding it, baby. Alright, hopefully I'm audible. If not, sucks. There we go. And let's check what time my class starts. 6. Cool, we good. We been chilling. Gotta align this up, figure this shit out. Alright, we got it. Okay. Edna had returned late from her bath, had dressed in some haste, and her face was flushed. Her head, set off by her dainty white gown, suggested a rich, rare blossom. She took her seat at the table between old Monsieur Farival and Madame Ratiganole. As she seated herself and was about to begin eating her soup, which had been served when she entered the room, several persons informed her simultaneously that Robert was going to Mexico. Finally! She laid her spoon down and looked about her bewildered. He had been with her, reading to her all morning, and had never even mentioned such a place as Mexico. She had not seen him during the afternoon, and she had heard someone say that he was at the house, upstairs with his mother. This she had thought nothing of, though she was surprised when he did not join her. Hello? Oh, it's because my fucking alt key is being pressed by my fucking microphone. Later in the afternoon, when she went down to the beach, she looked across at him where he sat beside Madame Lebrun, who presided. Edna's face was a blank picture of bewilderment, which she never thought of disguising. He lifted his eyebrows with the pretext of a smile as he returned her glance. He looked embarrassed and uneasy. "When is he going?" she asked, of everybody in general, as if Robert were not there to answer it for himself. "Tonight, this very evening. Did you ever? What possesses him?" were some of the replies she gathered, uttered simultaneously in French and English. "Impossible!" she exclaimed. "How can a person start off from Grand Isle to Mexico at a moment's notice, as if we were going over to Klein's or to the wharf or down to the beach?" "I said all along I was going to Mexico. I've been saying so for years." Thanks for the housing newsletter. Cried Robert, in an excited and irritable tone, with the air of a man defending himself against a swarm of stinging insects. Madame Lebrun knocked on the table with her knife handle. "Please let Robert explain why he is going, and why he is going tonight," she called out. "Really, this table is getting to be more and more like Bedlam every day, with everyone talking at once. Sometimes, I hope God will forgive me, but positively, sometimes I wish Victor would lose the power of speech. God damn!" Victor laughed sardonically as he thanked his mother for her holy wish, of which he failed to see the benefit to anybody except that it might afford her more ample opportunity and license to talk herself. Ouch. Monsieur Farival thought that Victor should have been taken out in mid-ocean in his earliest youth and drowned. Victor thought there would be more logic in thus disposing of old people with an established claim for making themselves universally obnoxious. Madame Lebrun grew a trifle hysterical. Robert called his brother some sharp, hard names. "There is nothing much to explain, Mother," he said, though he explained, nevertheless, looking chiefly at Edna, that he could only meet the gentleman whom he intended to join at Vera Cruz by taking such and such a steamer, which left New Orleans on such a day that Beaudelet was going out with his lugger load of vegetables that night, which gave him an opportunity of reaching the city and making his vessel in time. "But when did you make up your mind to all this?" demanded Monsieur Farival. "This afternoon," returned Robert, with a shade of annoyance. Fucker. What a guy. Oh, to live life like that. At what time this afternoon?" persisted the old gentleman, with nagging determinants. "Oh, shit. Lindsay Vaughn got a tibia fracture. Poor queen." Thanks, ESPN app. With nagging determination, as if you were cross-questioning a criminal in a court of justice. "At 4:00 this afternoon, Monsieur Farival," Robert replied in a high voice with a lofty air which reminded Edna of some gentleman on the stage. She had forced herself to eat most of her soup, and now she was picking the flaky bits of a court bouillon with her fork. I never know how to fucking say bouillon. It's a fucking bouillon cube, bitch. French ass soup. Gross. The lovers were profiting by the general conversation on Mexico to speak in whispers of matters which they rightly considered were interesting to no one but themselves. The lady in black had once received a pair of prayer beads of curious workmanship from Mexico, with a very special indulgence attached to them, but she had never been able to ascertain whether the indulgence extended outside the Mexican border. Huh? What does that mean? Whatever, man. But she had never been able to ascertain whether the indulgence extended outside the Mexican border. Father Fauchel of the cathedral had attempted to explain it, but he had not done so to her satisfaction, and she begged that Robert would interest himself and discover, if possible, whether she was entitled to the indulgence accompanying the remarkably curious Mexican prayer beads. Madame Bratiganole hoped that Robert would exercise extreme caution in dealing with the Mexicans, who she considered were a treacherous people, unscrupulous and revengeful. She trusted she did them no injustice in thus condemning them as a race. She had known personally but one Mexican who made and sold excellent tamales, and whom she would have trusted implicitly, so soft-spoken was he. One day he was arrested for stabbing his wife. She never knew whether he had been hanged or not. What a fucking story. Victor had grown hilarious and was attempting to tell an anecdote about a Mexican girl who served chocolate one winter in a restaurant in Dauphine Street. No one would listen to him but old Monsieur Farival, who went into convulsions over the droll story. This is like my grandpa telling me about the trans person at his work. Just like that, she exists. It's like, yes, there's this trans woman at my work. She used to be a man, and also she's Muslim. And I'm like, cool, what's the story? And he's like, she's trans and she's Muslim. I'm like, alright, dog, cool. I know a Mexican. Anyways. Edna wondered if they had all gone mad to be talking and clamoring at this rate. She herself could think of nothing to say about Mexico or the Mexicans. What a fucking book. At what time do you leave? She asked Robert. At 10, he told her. Beaudelet wants to wait for the moon. Are you all ready to go? Quite ready. I shall only take a handbag and shall pack my trunk in the city. Sure, bitch. He turned to answer some question put to him by his mother. My neck hurts. And Edna, having finished her black coffee, left the table. She went directly to her room. The little cottage was close and stuffy after leaving the outer air, but she did not mind. There appeared to be 100 different things demanding her attention indoors. She began to set the toilet stand to rights, grumbling at the negligence of the quadroon, who was in the adjoining room putting the children to bed. She gathered together stray garments that were hanging on the backs of chairs and put each where it belonged in the closet or bureau drawer. She changed her gown for a more comfortable and commodious wrapper. She arranged her hair, combing and brushing it with unusual energy. Then she went in and assisted the quadroon in getting the boys to bed. They were very playful and inclined to talk, to do anything but lie quiet and go to sleep. Edna sent the quadroon away to her supper and told her she need not return. Then she sat and told the children a story. Instead of soothing it excited them and added to their wakefulness. She left them in heated argument, speculating about the conclusion of the tale which their mother promised to finish the following night. The little black girl came in to say that Madame Lebrun would like to have Mrs. Pontellier go and sit with them over at the house till Mr. Robert went away. Edna returned answer that she had already undressed, but that she did not feel quite well, but perhaps she would go over to the house later. She started to dress again, and got as far advanced as to remove her peignoir. But changing her mind once more, she resumed the peignoir, and went outside and sat down before her door. She was overheated and irritable, and fanned herself energetically for a while. Madame Ratignolle came down to discover what was the matter. All that noise and confusion at the table must have upset me, replied Edna, and moreover, I hate shocks and surprises. The idea of Robert starting off in such a ridiculously sudden and dramatic way, as if it were a matter of life and death, never saying a word about it all morning when he was with me. Yes, agreed Madame Ratignolle. I think it was showing us all, you especially, very little consideration. It wouldn't have surprised me in any of the others. Those Lebruns are all given to heroics. But I must say I should never have expected such a thing from Robert. Are you not coming down? Come on, dear. It doesn't look friendly. No, said Edna, a little sullenly. I can't go to the trouble of dressing again. I don't feel like it. You needn't dress. You look all right. Fasten a belt around your waist. Just look at me. No, persisted Edna, but you go on. Madame Lebrun might be offended if we both stayed away. Madame Ratignolle kissed Edna goodnight and went away, being in truth rather desirous of joining the general and animated conversation which was still in progress concerning Mexico and the Mexicans. I bet she fucking was. Somewhat later, Robert came up, carrying his handbag. Aren't you feeling well? He asked. Oh, well enough. Are you going right away? He lit a match and looked at his watch. In 20 minutes, he said. The sudden and brief flare of the match emphasized the darkness for a while. He sat down upon a stool which the children had left out on the porch. Get a chair, said Edna. This will do, he replied. He put on his soft hat and nervously took it off again, wiping his face with a handkerchief and complaining of the heat. Take the fan, said Edna, offering it to him. Oh, no, thank you. It does no good. You'll have to stop fanning sometime and feel all the more uncomfortable afterwards. That's one of the ridiculous things which men always say. I've never known one to speak otherwise of fanning. How long will you be gone? Forever, perhaps. I don't know. It depends on a good many things. Well, in case it shouldn't be forever, how long will it be? I don't know. This seems to me perfectly presumptuous and uncalled for. I don't like it. I don't understand your motive for silence and mystery, never saying a word to me about it this morning. He remained silent, not offering to defend himself. He only said after a moment, Don't part from me in any ill humor. I never knew you to be out of patience with me before. I don't want to part in any ill humor, she said, but can't you understand? I have grown used to seeing you, to having you with me all the time, and your action seems unfriendly, even unkind. You don't even offer an excuse for it. Why, I was planning to be together, thinking of how pleasant it would be to see you in the city next winter. So was I, he blurted. Perhaps that's the... He stood up suddenly and held out his hand. Goodbye, my dear Mrs. Pontellier. Goodbye. I hope you won't completely forget me. She clung to his hand, striving to detain him. Write me when you get there, won't you, Robert? I will, thank you. Goodbye. Sorry, I'm repositioning again. How unlike Robert. The merest acquaintance would have said something more empathetic like, I will, thank you, goodbye. Then I will thank you goodbye to such a ruthless. I was like, that's the same thing he fucking said. He had evidently already taken leave of the people over at the house, for he had descended the steps and went to join Beaudelet, who was out there with an oar across his shoulder waiting for Robert. Oi! They walked away in the darkness. She could only hear Beaudelet's voice. Robert had apparently not even spoken a word of greeting to his companion. Oh, my phone. Water bottle. Edna bit her handkerchief convulsively, striving to hold back and to hide, even from herself, as she would have hidden from another, the emotion which was tearing her. Her eyes were brimming with tears. For the first time, she recognized the symptoms of infatuation, which she had felt incipiently as a child, as a girl in her earliest teens, and later as a young woman. The recognition did not lessen the reality, the poignancy, of the revelation by any suggestion or promise of instability. The past was nothing to her, offered no lesson which she was willing to heed. The future was a mystery which she never attempted to penetrate. The present alone was significant, was hers, to torture her as it was doing, then, with the biting conviction that she had lost that which she had held, that she had been denied that which her impassioned, newly awakened being demanded. "Do you miss your friend greatly?" asked Mademoiselle Reyes one morning as she came creeping up behind Edna, who had just left her cottage on the way to the beach. She spent much of her time in the water since she had acquired finally the art of swimming. As their stay in Grand Isle drew near its close, she felt that she could not give too much time to a diversion which afforded her the only real pleasurable moments that she knew. When Mademoiselle Reyes came and touched her upon the shoulder and spoke to her, the woman seemed to echo the thought which was ever in Edna's mind, or, better, the feeling which constantly possessed her. My fucking neck hurts, man. Robert's going had some way taken the brightness, the color, the meaning out of everything. The conditions of her life were in no way changed, but her whole existence was dulled, like a faded garment, which seems to be no longer worth wearing. She sought him everywhere, in others whom she induced to talk about him. She went up in the mornings to Madame Lebrun's room, braving the clatter of the old sewing machine. She sat there and chatted at intervals, as Robert had done. She gazed around the room at the pictures and photographs hanging upon the wall, and discovered in some corner an old family album, which she examined with the keenest interest, appealing to Madame Lebrun for enlightenment concerning the many figures and faces which she discovered between its pages. There was a picture of Madame Lebrun with Robert as a baby, seated in her lap, a round-faced infant with a fist in his mouth. The eyes alone in the baby suggested the man, and that he was also in kilts at the age of 5, wearing long curls and holding a whip in his hand. It made Edna laugh, and she laughed too, at the portrait of his first long trousers, while another interested her, taken when he left for college, looking thin, long-faced, and with eyes full of fire, ambition, and great intentions. But there was no recent picture, none which suggested the Robert who had gone away 5 days ago, leaving a void and wilderness behind him. Oh, Robert stopped having his picture taken when he had to pay for them himself. Cheap viewers at your mother's house! Shit, where's my mod tools? Anyways. Ah, shit. Subway Surfers is gone. How far into this shit am I? God, I'm not even halfway. Fuck. Alright, guys, I'm tired. Not even halfway is crazy, bro. It's because I'm reading it out loud. It's harder to, get through fast when I'm reading out loud, I fear. But, unfortunately, I take more in when I do that, so whatever. What does that mean? I don't understand. What percent am I? That's a lie, bitch. That's not. No. 32%. Alright, gang. Well, at that note, because I don't care about cheap viewers and I don't want them. Bye-bye. Yeah. Fucking that's it. I read enough of that shit.